NATO defence ministers have pledged to ramp up production of ammunition to help Ukraine fight off Russian troops. This comes after warnings that Ukraine is firing artillery rounds much faster than its Western backers are producing them. It's a critical moment in the war. Russia is believed to be gearing up to a major new offensive in eastern Ukraine, and the Ukrainians want to hit back with their own counter-offensive. At the meeting in Brussels, the Secretary-General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said that even with the new commitments, quicker manufacturing was still needed.
Things are happening, but we need to continue. We need to step up even more because there is a big need out there to provide Ukraine with ammunition. This is now becoming a grinding war of attrition, and a war of attrition is a war of logistics, and therefore this is so crucial for our ability to ensure that Ukraine wins, is able to retake territory and launch offensives that ensures that it's able to win the war and to prevail as a sovereign independent nation.
Our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale has more on those talks in Brussels.
At the start of this meeting yesterday, Jens Stoltenberg warned that Ukraine was using up artillery, tank ammunition in larger quantities than it was being produced by NATO members. Now, there has been some movement, so a number of countries, including the US, France, a number of other countries, agreeing to ramp up production. And when you ask the crucial question, will Ukraine run out of ammunition? I mean, you get a variety of answers. You know, some military analysts will tell you that, well, it depends how much they use, and they've got to use their ammunition stocks wisely, Ukraine. They can't match the amounts of ammunition being used by Russia. So, for example, Russia firing, thousands of artillery rounds a day. Ukraine at the moment can fire about 2,000 to 3,000. It has been much higher earlier in the war, as much as 6,000, 7,000, but it's gone down a bit. But they're having to be much more careful about being precise with the use of those weapons. So the intelligence that the West has been helping provide Ukraine to target those ammunition stocks, particularly with those HIMARS rocket systems, has been very crucial. But it clearly is a concern. They clearly need to ramp up production. They are doing that slowly. But remember, these countries are at peace. They're not at wartime like Ukraine. And so it isn't quite the same approach. But they are making efforts to do that so that Ukraine does not run out of ammunition. Now, there are other issues that have been discussed here, but, one of the issues, Ukraine thinks fighter jets are a priority. Clearly not for most NATO countries here. They have not made any pledges at all about fighter jets, and they see that as a long-term need for Ukraine. Nothing about any immediate support for Ukraine on that. We know British are going to train Ukrainian fighters, but they're not going to provide planes, certainly not in the near future. So that was one issue, I think, that we got some closure on, if you like, here at this conference.
Jonathan Beale. Over the past 12 years, the civil war in Syria has forced nearly 7 million people to flee their country, settling across the Middle East, Europe, North America and even beyond. Now, after last week's massive earthquakes in Turkey and Syria, which have killed more than 41,000 people, Syrians living abroad have been desperately trying to contact loved ones back home. One of them was Afra Hashem, a Syrian human rights advocate who lives in the UK. It took her days to learn that 11 of her relatives had died.
Syria became suddenly like trying to use internet, just WhatsApp, to reach to their family. I started to call, but that connection was like cut suddenly. So 3 days of waiting for any news. And I discovered that I have 2 cousins, one of them in Syria and the other escaped to Turkey. And both family died because of the earthquake.
Yes, more than half of the Syrians who fled abroad live in Turkey, and thousands of them, having thought that they'd reached safety, have instead lost relatives or seen their new homes destroyed by the earthquakes. Many of them now simply want to return to Syria. Laura Bicker reports from the border on the families who are once again uprooting their lives.
There are thousands of families waiting here at the border, trying to get back into Syria. They survived the earthquake, but most of what they had, what they'd managed to build after fleeing bombardment in Syria, is now destroyed. I met one family who've lived in Turkey for 9 years. Their children were born in Turkey, and their apartment in Hatay has been completely destroyed. They are clinging to a single suitcase, which is all they have left. They have 2 young children, one of whom has a head injury. They said they went to the hospital in Adana and couldn't get treatment because the hospital is full. That's been a recurring theme when I've spoken to many families here. We've been told by some of the border guards that several thousand families have already crossed. Officially, Syrians are being allowed across the border for 2 months. And the Turkish government said if they return within that time, they will be allowed back in. But speaking to them, the reality is many of them will try to stay with their families in Syria if they can. The real heartbreak for many of these Syrian people is this is crisis upon crisis. They've already had to rebuild their lives in Turkey. They tried to find jobs, they tried to have schools for their children, and now they've lost everything and will have to once again find the strength to rebuild in Syria.
Laura Bicker. A toddler with a rare but devastating genetic condition has become one of only a handful of people in the world to receive a life-saving new gene therapy. But her family's joy is mingled with sadness as the child's 3-year-old sister is too old to receive the groundbreaking drug. Developed by a British company, it's the most expensive medicine in Europe, costing over $3 million per patient.
This is the moment 1-year-old Teddy received a life-saving gene therapy, a single infusion of a drug aimed at stopping her disease in its tracks. Teddy has MLD, metachromatic leukodystrophy, a rare genetic disorder. Professor Simon Jones, who's been treating MLD patients at Royal Manchester Children's Hospital for nearly 20 years, says it's a devastating condition.
There's mistakes in a gene, which means the body can't make an enzyme. The job of that enzyme is to break down a really important chemical for how our brain functions and works. And so it gradually builds up in the brain until this sort of catastrophic point, usually about the age of 2, where children start to lose all of those abilities.
Teddy's elder sister, 3-year-old Nala, also has MLD, but she can't be treated as the condition was identified too late when irreparable damage was already done. From being a bright and active toddler, Nala is now terminally ill, unable to walk or talk, and is tube-fed. The girl's mum is Ali Shaw.
So when they told us that there was treatment available for Teddy, it was a bitter pill to swallow because Nala can't be helped. So, we're extremely grateful in one sense and then really sad on the other sense.
LibMeldy costs £2.8 million, the most expensive drug ever approved for the NHS, although a confidential discount has been agreed. Only around 7 or 8 children a year in the UK are likely to be eligible, which will limit the returns to the drug company, which is already trialling similar therapies for other genetic disorders.
Teddy, what should we play with Nala? Hi, Nolly.
6 months after receiving LibMeldy, Teddy is back home in Northumberland and thriving. While it can't yet be called a cure, other children who received it as part of clinical trials in Italy are still doing well several years on. But Ali and her husband Jake know their time with their eldest daughter Nala is limited. Jake has recorded a song for her, hoping to raise awareness of MLD, one of the most devastating of genetic conditions.
The woman who's been head of Scotland's government for the past 8 years has unexpectedly announced that she's stepping down. Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, has been a leading advocate of Scottish independence from the United Kingdom, even more so after Britain's exit from the European Union. But she's faced growing pressure over her strategy for achieving independence and also over transgender rights. At a hastily arranged news conference, Ms Sturgeon denied her departure was down to this pressure. But in an echo of the recent resignation by New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, said she felt she could no longer give her demanding job the commitment it deserved.
A First Minister is never off duty. Particularly in this day and age, there is virtually no privacy. Even ordinary stuff that most people take for granted, like going for a coffee with friends or for a walk on your own, becomes very difficult. And the nature and form of modern political discourse means that there is a much greater intensity, dare I say it, brutality to life as a politician than in years gone by. All in all, and actually for a long time without it being apparent, it takes its toll on you and on those around you.
I asked our Scotland correspondent James Shaw if Ms Sturgeon's resignation had come as a big shock.
It really has, and it may be the case that Nicola Sturgeon perhaps only made up her mind to make an announcement yesterday. During her statement, during questions after her statement, she said that she'd been at the funeral of a long-time activist in the Scottish National Party, her party, and at that moment she said that clarified her feelings about whether she should stay in the job. She said those feelings had been growing since the start of the year. So that's the personal side of it, the fact that she wants to end her political career and perhaps go on and do something different outside politics. But then there is also the politics itself, and a feeling she said she had that maybe she was becoming an obstacle to Scotland achieving independence, which is what the SNP wants to do. Her policy is that there should be that the next general election in the UK should be a de facto referendum on independence, so voting for the SNP would mean that you wanted independence. And there's a lot of doubt, I think, in her party about whether that is the right policy. So by stepping aside, she says she is allowing her party to possibly take a new direction if that's what it decides it wants to do.
As you say, a lot of criticism over her policy on making the next general election here in the UK a de facto referendum on Scottish independence. Where does this leave the cause?
It's a really good question, and when you think of the fact that the previous leader, Alex Salmond, did manage to get a referendum for independence in 2014, so 8 years ago, Nicola Sturgeon pushed for that and didn't achieve it. So I think a lot depends on who the new leader is and the argument, the pitch that they put to their party and to Scotland itself as to what they are going to do or how they are going to achieve that objective of independence, and judging the extent to which Scottish people want to commit to that when there are all sorts of other issues to think about, not least the cost of living crisis and the war in Ukraine.
And also there's been this big row in Scotland over transgender rights.
There has. That's been a really difficult issue for the SNP and for Nicola Sturgeon. And you do get the sense that that is one of the things that may have ground her down to some extent. They have this deal with the Scottish Greens, who are fully in favour of enhancing transgender rights, which means that the SNP itself is also committed to that. And I think that has been a difficulty because there have been huge objections to it, and also the party in favour of it is also very dogmatic about insisting that making it easier for people to transition and to have that legally recognised is vitally important to them. So yes, I think that has been a wearing and a difficult process for her as First Minister.